A young girl vanished after a visit to the Vatican, leaving her mother in heartbreak. For 3 months, there were no answers, no clues, just an aching silence. But then, just weeks before Pope Francis' funeral, something unexpected was found. What they discovered next would shock everyone. What really happened to Sophia Matthews? And how did the Vatican play a part in it all? The Matthews family had traveled thousands of miles from the United States, their hearts full of excitement and anticipation. For Laura, a single mother who had worked tirelessly to provide a better life for her daughter, this was the trip she had dreamed of, a chance to show Sophia the world, to give her an experience she'd never forget. They arrived in Rome just days earlier, and the city had already started to weave its magic. The cobblestone streets, the ancient buildings, the air that seemed thick with history. They had visited the Colosseum, wandered through the Roman Forum, and stood at the foot of the Pantheon, marveling at the grandeur of it all. But today was special. Today, they would visit the Vatican, a place both sacred and awe-inspiring. The holy city within a city, where the world's most renowned art and history converged. It was the perfect spot for mother and daughter to bond, to create memories that would last forever. As they walked towards St. Peter's Square, the crowds thickened, but they didn't mind. The warmth of the sun was a welcome contrast to the cool, marble buildings around them. Laura smiled as she watched Sophia, her face lit up with wonder, taking in every detail, every statue, every fountain. They approached the massive obelisk in the center of the square, the heart of it all, where tourists gathered from all over the world to snap photos. Sophia pulled on her mother's sleeve, eager to pose in front of the iconic structure. "Mom! Take a picture of me!" she said, her voice bubbly and bright. Laura chuckled and lifted her camera, clicking the shutter as Sophia jumped into a playful pose. "You're growing up so fast," Laura murmured, as her daughter struck another pose. Sophia laughed and took a step back to admire the photo on the camera's screen. Laura had always felt so fortunate to have such a joyful, spirited child. They were inseparable, her and Sophia. No one could understand that bond, that deep, protective love, except the two of them. After spending some time exploring the square, they made their way to the Vatican museums. Laura marveled at the Sistine Chapel, at the art that had withstood centuries. She was in awe of the history, but it wasn't until they stepped into the Raphael rooms that Sophia's excitement reached new heights. The ceilings, decorated with intricate frescoes, seemed to stretch forever. Sophia's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper as she looked up in awe. "Mom, look! It's so beautiful," she said. "I know, sweetheart," Laura replied softly, her hand instinctively reaching out to hold her daughter's, offering her the safety and comfort only a mother's hand could provide. They spent hours wandering through the museums, their feet sore but their spirits lifted by the magnificence around them. They laughed and joked, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed so far away, nothing but the two of them in the heart of this ancient city. When they finally exited the museums, they made their way back to St. Peter's Square. It was late in the afternoon, the sunlight casting long shadows across the square, and the crowds had started to thin out. Laura, still wrapped up in the beauty of the day, glanced down at her watch. They had been there longer than they realized, but they were both still so energized by the experience. "Let's go grab a gelato," Laura suggested, grinning as she looked down at her daughter, who had been walking beside her, hand in hand, up until that very moment. Sophia was excited about the prospect, and they started toward the exit of the square. But as they approached the edge, something shifted. Something unspoken passed between them, the kind of shift that occurs when the world suddenly feels off. Laura stopped in her tracks. "Sophia?" she called, looking down at her daughter. Sophia, who had been happily skipping ahead, didn't respond immediately. Laura's hand tightened around her daughter's, but when she glanced down, the warmth of her hand was suddenly gone. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, scanning the area around her, but there was no sign of Sophia. The crowds, while not as dense as before, were still scattered in the square. Laura's stomach twisted in a knot. Her mind raced, and panic began to seep in. She couldn't have gone far, right? But as seconds stretched into minutes, her heart pounded harder. She called out, her voice trembling. "Sophia! Sweetheart, where are you?" The name escaped her lips in a desperate whisper. She could feel her pulse racing in her neck, her hands shaking. She retraced her steps, calling out her daughter's name louder, the sound of her own voice now foreign and fearful. But no answer. Laura's body moved on its own now. She pushed past people, her eyes darting from face to face, searching for any sign of her daughter. Nothing. The square, once so full of energy, suddenly felt like an empty abyss, a cavern that swallowed every sound and every heartbeat. A few minutes later, panic turned into a chilling realization. Sophia was nowhere to be found. Laura's breath came in short, uneven gasps, her eyes frantically searching for someone, anyone who might have seen something. She ran to the nearest police officer she could find. My daughter is missing!" she cried, her voice cracked with fear. The officer's expression hardened with immediate concern, and he quickly radioed for help. "We're going to find her, ma'am," he said, though his tone didn't mask the growing concern in his eyes. "Stay with me." Laura was barely aware of the sounds around her, her eyes only fixed on the square, on the crowds, on the faces that seemed to blur in front of her. How could this happen? Where was Sophia? In the midst of her frantic searching, a soft voice broke through the chaos. A man, older, with a furrowed brow, stepped up to her. "I saw something," he said quietly. "I saw a woman with a child walking away from the square. She was holding the child's hand. She didn't look like a tourist, though. I didn't think much of it at the time." Laura's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak beneath her. The officer nodded at the man, motioning for him to repeat what he had seen. But all Laura could think of was that moment, when she had let go of Sophia's hand, just for a second. A woman, holding a child's hand, leaving the square. Could it have been Sophia? Had someone taken her right under their noses? The officer turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "We need to find this woman now. Stay close." But Laura's thoughts were already elsewhere. Who was she? Why didn't anyone else notice her leaving with a child? Was this just a terrible coincidence, or had something much darker happened in the heart of the Vatican? And in the distance, beyond the chaos, something ominous began to stir. Something deeper. Something none of them could have prepared for. But before they could investigate further, the woman and child vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions. What was happening? The answers weren't going to come easily. And they certainly weren't going to come quickly. At that moment, something inside Laura cracked. She hadn't just lost a daughter. Someone had taken her. And with the day fading into night, she realized that the search was only just beginning. Laura sat at a small table in a cafe just off St. Peter's Square. The coffee in front of her had long gone cold, forgotten, as she stared out the window, watching the world continue around her, indifferent to her pain. People walked by in a haze of normalcy, laughing, chatting, sightseeing, but all she could feel was the gaping hole in her chest, the crushing emptiness where Sophia's laughter should have been. A sharp vibration from her phone broke the silence of the moment, and she glanced at the screen. The number was from the local police department. Her hand shook slightly as she picked up the call, her heart racing with a glimmer of hope. Perhaps they had found her daughter. "Hello?" Her voice was hoarse, strained from the hours of crying, the hours of relentless worry. "Ma'am, we haven't found her yet." The officer's voice was heavy with something Laura couldn't quite place. "But we're still looking. We're doing everything we can." Her grip tightened around the phone. "How can you say that?" she whispered. "You're telling me you still haven't found anything?" "Nothing at all." The officer paused for a moment, the silence filling the air like a suffocating fog. "We're checking the security footage, ma'am. We've analyzed every angle, every corner of St. Peter's Square. We haven't seen anything. No signs of her, no unusual activity. It's like she just vanished." She felt her knees give out, the weight of his words crashing into her. The phone slipped from her ear, her hand falling to her lap as she tried to steady herself. The room around her blurred. How could this be? How could her daughter disappear without a trace, without even a single clue left behind? "Ma'am?" The officer's voice crackled through the phone again, pulling her back from the abyss. "Are you still there?" "I'm here," she managed, though the words tasted bitter in her mouth. We'll keep you updated, but please, try to stay in the area. We may need you to help us with a few more questions soon. The officer's voice softened, but the helplessness was clear. We're doing everything we can. Laura ended the call with a click, unable to say another word. She sat there, holding the phone in her trembling hands, as the world outside continued to move, unaffected by the storm raging inside her. The days that followed blurred together, a haze of phone calls, interviews, and endless waiting. Laura found herself pacing through hotel rooms, speaking to detectives who spoke in hushed tones, pretending to reassure her as they, too, were overwhelmed by the lack of progress. The search for Sophia stretched on, turning into an exhausting cycle of interviews and dead ends. Police combed every corner of Rome, retraced every step Sophia might have taken, yet they found nothing. The security footage, the only lead they had, was a blur of tourists and ordinary moments. The cameras had caught glimpses of people passing through St. Peter's Square, but no sign of Sophia, no one who seemed to notice the young girl disappearing into the crowd. It was as if she had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the memory of her smile. The media caught wind of the case, and soon, news outlets were reporting on the disappearance of the young American girl, her face plastered across television screens and newspapers. Laura's face, too, appeared everywhere, tear-streaked and desperate. But even as the search grew in intensity, the evidence grew colder. At first, there had been hope. She could see it in the eyes of the officers, the detectives. They had made the usual assurances, "We'll find her. We just need more time." But as the days turned to weeks, that hope faded. They kept working, but it was clear that the momentum was slipping away, and so was their belief that they would find Sophia. Then, the Vatican issued a statement, just days into the investigation. A simple message of prayer, offering their condolences, promising their support. But that was all it was, words on a page. There was no mention of their involvement in the investigation, no offer to provide any resources. The message felt cold, distant. Prayers, they said? It was like they had distanced themselves from the entire ordeal, as though they were absolved from responsibility. Laura found herself staring at the screen where the statement appeared, feeling a strange chill settle in her chest. Had the Vatican forgotten about Sophia already? Or were they hiding something? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than they were willing to reveal. The search continued without answers, each new day weighing heavier than the last. Laura's heart felt heavy, each moment dragging her further into uncertainty. As the weeks wore on, Laura's mind began to spiral into darker thoughts. She thought about the rumors she had overheard at the police station. Maybe Sophia had been taken by someone else, they whispered. Maybe it wasn't just a random disappearance. Some of the officers had hinted at the possibility that the Vatican might have a part in it, though they never dared to elaborate. Why would they think that? What could the Vatican possibly be hiding? Days slipped into weeks, and with each passing hour, Laura's hope began to fade. Sophia had been missing for too long. People had stopped looking with the same urgency, and the case grew colder with each passing day. The phone calls from the police became less frequent, the updates growing more distant. "We're still working on it," they would say, but Laura heard the weariness in their voices, the way the words felt like empty promises. She didn't need their sympathy anymore. She needed answers. She needed her daughter. One night, when the darkness seemed to swallow the room whole, a small glimmer of hope flickered. Laura was sitting alone in the small hotel room, clutching her daughter's photo in her hands, when the phone rang. She nearly dropped the photo in surprise, scrambling to answer. Her heart raced, beating louder than the dial tone. "Laura Matthews?" A voice, unfamiliar but firm, greeted her on the other end. "Yes, this is Laura," she said, trying to steady her breath. She could barely hear herself over the roar of her own pulse. "We have a lead," the voice said. "It's not much, but we've got something. It's worth investigating." Her pulse quickened, the faintest flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Could this be it? Could they finally have found something? The officer continued, his voice lowering. "We've reviewed some additional footage. A man was seen in the square, talking to a woman. We think they might have seen your daughter. We're not sure, but we need you to come in tomorrow. We'll need you to look at the footage. I'll be there." Laura said, her voice firm. I'll be there as soon as I can. As the call ended, she sat there, trembling. The only thing that was certain now was the question that haunted her: what was the Vatican hiding? Had Sophia disappeared into thin air, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Detective Maria Valente sat in the small, dimly lit office, a map of Rome spread out before her, with lines and pins marking various locations connected to Sophia Matthews' disappearance. The room was cluttered with papers, photos of the missing girl, statements, and security footage printouts, but no matter how many times she scanned the information, nothing was adding up. A faint headache tugged at her temples. She could feel the weight of the case, the pressure mounting with each passing day. Her colleagues were leaning toward the possibility that Sophia had been kidnapped, taken by someone who knew what they were doing. But Valente wasn't so sure. Something about this case didn't sit right. Her gut told her there was more to the story than just a random crime. The Vatican's silence in all of this only deepened the mystery. Despite the grandiose security surrounding the Vatican, the overwhelming presence of cameras, and the army of security personnel, there had been no substantial footage, no leads. It didn't add up. How could a child simply vanish from one of the most heavily monitored places in the world? Valente's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Detective Valente? The officer standing in the doorway was holding a phone in his hand, his face unreadable. Yes? Valente looked up, her fingers tapping the edge of the desk nervously. We've got another call from the anonymous tipster. Same person as before. They're claiming to have seen a woman leaving the Vatican with Sophia. Valente's heart skipped a beat. This tipster had been calling for weeks, each time offering a sliver of information that never quite pieced together. But this was different. If they were telling the truth, if they had seen something, this could be the break they needed. She stood up from her desk and walked over to the officer. Put them through. I want to hear it for myself. As the phone call was connected, Valente felt her pulse quicken. The voice on the other end was calm, steady. It was always the same, unemotional, detached. But this time, there was a crackle of urgency in the tone. I saw her, the voice said. I saw the woman, the one who had the child. They left the square together, walked out, and I remember thinking, who takes a child like that? The voice paused for a moment. They were heading toward the little alley behind St. Peter's Basilica. I saw them, but I didn't think to stop them. I didn't think it was important. Valente's eyes narrowed as she scribbled the location on her notepad. You didn't think it was important? She repeated, her voice rising slightly with frustration. Do you realize how many hours we've spent searching for this girl? How many dead ends we've hit because no one thought to speak up earlier? The voice faltered. I didn't know. I thought it was just a mother and child. Just like any other. Valente exhaled, closing her eyes briefly. Did you see anything else? Anything that might help us? The tipster hesitated. No, nothing. Just the alley. But I remember the woman was walking quickly, like she was trying to hide. She had a scarf on, covering most of her face. Valente's grip tightened on the phone. A scarf. That detail echoed in her mind. It felt like a key that could lead them somewhere they hadn't been before. Thank you, Valente said, her voice now softer. We'll be looking into that alley. If you remember anything else, don't hesitate to call. She hung up, the room heavy with the weight of the information. She turned to the officer. Get a team to that alley. Immediately. I want every inch of it searched. And make sure we have all the CCTV footage from the area. Days passed, but the investigation seemed to be sinking deeper into the mire. The alley behind St. Peter's Basilica had been thoroughly checked. Nothing. No evidence, no signs of Sophia, and no new leads. Valente couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led in circles, each time only to end up at the same starting point. The Vatican, still silent, had offered no new information. No one was talking. The staff in the square had all been questioned, but none of them had seen anything unusual. There were no unusual movements, no signs of someone sneaking away with a child. The security footage, carefully analyzed again, was just as empty as before. Everything seemed to blur into the same pattern, nothing. Valente rubbed her eyes, exhaustion setting in. She had become a ghost in her own life, drowning in the same unanswered questions day after day. She couldn't fathom what had happened to Sophia or why it had been so easy for whoever was behind this to vanish without a trace. As she sat at her desk, the phone rang again. It was the same officer from before. His voice, usually steady, had a crack in it. "Detective, you're going to want to hear this." Valente sat up, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" "We've got a lead. A man came in. Claims he's been working near the Vatican for years. Says he saw something strange the day Sophia disappeared." She pushed her chair back, her heart now hammering in her chest. "What did he see?" "Don't know yet, but he's insistent. He wants to speak to you directly. Something about a woman he saw in the crowd. He says she's connected to something bigger." "Bigger? Like what?" Valente snapped, frustration rising. "We've already been through everything. We've looked at every lead, every person. What's different about this one?" The officer hesitated. "I don't know, Detective. But he says it's something to do with the Vatican itself." Valente met the man the next morning in an interrogation room. His name was Gianluca, a local contractor who worked on the buildings surrounding St. Peter's Square. He was a middle-aged man, his face weathered by years of hard labor, but there was a nervous energy about him that set Valente on edge. "I don't know what this has to do with the girl, but I saw something," Gianluca began, his voice shaking slightly. "Tell me what you saw," Valente said, leaning forward. He wiped his palms on his pants before speaking again. "I was working on a renovation project near the square, close to the Vatican museums. I saw a woman who wasn't supposed to be there. She was standing by the gate, watching the tourists, but she wasn't just looking around. She was waiting, like she was expecting someone. And then, she spoke to a man." "A man? Do you know who he was?" Valente's voice sharpened. "No. But I know it wasn't the first time they'd met. She handed him something, looked like a key or a note. Then she disappeared into the crowd." Valente paused. "A note? A key?" This was the kind of information she needed. Small pieces of a puzzle that had been incomplete for so long. "And what does this have to do with Sophia Matthews?" she asked, her voice cold. Gianluca looked up, his eyes wide. "I don't know for sure, but the woman, the man, they weren't tourists. They were too focused, too deliberate. I've worked in this area for years, and I've never seen anyone move like that." Valente leaned back, her thoughts racing. Could there be a connection between this mysterious woman and Sophia's disappearance? Was it possible that there was something hidden in the Vatican, something no one had ever suspected? As Gianluca continued to speak, Valente's mind was already moving ahead. This could be it. This could be the break they needed. The investigation had stalled, yes. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the truth seemed closer than ever. They were no longer chasing shadows. Something was brewing beneath the surface, something larger than they had ever imagined. And just as Valente was about to take the next step, something unexpected happened. A new lead appeared. A new clue that would change everything. 3 months had passed since Sophia Matthews vanished from St. Peter's Square, and with each day that passed, the search had turned from hopeful determination to a haunting routine of dead ends. Laura had spent those months chasing any shred of hope, anything that might lead her to her daughter. But as the days bled into one another, a sinking feeling had settled in her stomach. The police, though diligent, had nothing new to offer. The Vatican, too, remained strangely silent, as if Sophie's disappearance was just another small ripple in a world too vast to notice. Laura's world had shrunk. There were no more carefree days in Rome, no more visits to cafes or strolling through the historic streets. The joy and energy of the city had been replaced by a constant, gnawing fear. She didn't sleep much anymore. The hotel room she stayed in felt like a prison, every quiet corner reminding her that her daughter was still gone. She had stopped hoping, not because she wanted to, but because hope had started to feel like a cruel joke. One late afternoon, as she sat by the window staring out at the slowly dimming sky, her phone buzzed on the table in front of her. A call from the police. She sat still for a long moment, almost afraid to answer. What if it was another dead end? What if they were just calling to let her know they hadn't found anything? But she couldn't stop herself. She picked up the phone, her hands trembling as she pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" Her voice cracked. "Mrs. Matthews?" The officer's voice was tight with something she couldn't place. "We need you to come to the station. We have something." The words, so simple, had her heart pounding. "What is it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "There's been a discovery," the officer said. "We found something. Something that might be linked to your daughter." Laura's breath caught in her throat. She stood up quickly, grabbing her bag. "I'll be there right away." The police station was busy as usual, the hum of activity drowning out any sense of urgency. Laura followed the officer down a narrow corridor, her thoughts racing with the possibility of what they had found. Her heart was thumping, each step taking her closer to an answer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming next would be nothing like what she had expected. The officer led her into a small, dimly lit room where a man in his late 40s, wearing glasses and a dusty jacket, stood by a table covered in old documents and artifacts. Laura's eyes scanned the room quickly, but it was the man's tired, solemn expression that caught her attention. "This is Dr. Franco DeMarco," the officer said. "He's the archaeologist who found the journal." Laura nodded numbly, barely hearing him. She couldn't take her eyes off the man, wondering what could possibly be so important to bring her here today. Dr. DeMarco cleared his throat. "Mrs. Matthews, I'm afraid what I'm about to show you is unsettling." Laura took a deep breath. "Just tell me what it is." He gestured to the table. On it was an old, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and fragile from years of neglect. It didn't look like much at first glance. The edges of the journal were frayed, and the leather was cracked, but there was something undeniably heavy about it, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. The journal was buried beneath the floor of a church near the Vatican, Dr. DeMarco explained. "I was part of a team working on some restoration projects in the area. It was a routine dig. We had no idea what we were uncovering." He looked at her gravely. "When I opened the journal, I found things that, well, let's just say it's not what we expected." Laura stepped forward slowly, her gaze still fixed on the journal. "What do you mean? What's in it?" Dr. DeMarco hesitated before picking up the journal carefully, as if it might fall apart at any moment. He opened it to a page halfway through, where a series of handwritten entries were scrawled in fading ink. He pointed to the first paragraph. "It's dated over a century ago," he said. "The entries mention rituals, strange practices, and children. They were all tied to the Vatican, though the details are vague." Laura's pulse quickened. Children. The word echoed in her mind, but it didn't make sense. What did this have to do with Sophia? Dr. DeMarco turned the page. "The journal describes secret meetings, things that were never meant to be known. It refers to something called the Hidden Order, a group within the church, people who were involved in something much darker than we ever realized. There are mentions of children, specifically about how they were used, hidden away, protected." Laura's stomach twisted. "What do you mean, used?" She could barely bring herself to ask the question, but the words came out anyway. Dr. DeMarco paused before answering. "There are references to a child named Sophia, though the last name isn't mentioned. The entries describe rituals and mentions of recruiting children for something the church deemed important. But it's unclear, there's so little information here. Only cryptic notes." A chill ran down Laura's spine. Her breath hitched. The name. Her daughter's name. It was impossible, wasn't it? The officer, sensing Laura's shock, stepped forward. "We thought it was just a coincidence at first, but then, we noticed something." He pointed to another entry in the journal, this one more specific. The handwriting seemed more hurried, urgent. "There's a passage here," the officer continued, "about an event that took place just before a major Vatican ceremony. It talks about Sophia of the Innocents, a reference to a child. And the dates are so close to when your daughter went missing." Laura could hardly breathe. Her legs felt like they might give out. "Are you saying?" Her voice cracked. "Are you saying this journal is connected to my daughter?" "We're not sure," the officer said carefully, but his voice betrayed the uncertainty in his eyes. But the references to Sophia are too specific to ignore. And there's more. We need you to look at this. There's a mention of a location, something that could be tied to a hidden place. A place near the Vatican where these rituals took place. Laura's hands shook as she reached for the journal. She turned the pages quickly, her eyes scanning the words, searching for anything that might lead her to her daughter. Her heart stopped when she saw it, a passage scrawled near the back. It was brief, a simple sentence written in hurried, jagged letters. She is the key, and her time will come. The words hit her like a slap. She is the key. What did it mean? Why was her daughter mentioned here, in a journal buried under the Vatican? Why was Sophia, of all children, tied to this? Do you know who wrote this? Laura's voice was barely a whisper. She couldn't take her eyes off the words, the eerie promise they held. Dr. DeMarco shook his head. The handwriting is too old to trace. But there's something else. He paused. The last entry is a warning. A note written in the margin, do not follow the child. The consequences are irreversible. Laura's hands trembled violently as she held the journal. What had she just uncovered? She felt the weight of the journal press down on her chest, suffocating her. The officer looked at her, his voice low. We need to know who hid this journal, and why it's connected to your daughter. This might be the key to everything. Laura stood frozen, her mind racing with questions. What was the connection between this journal and Sophia's disappearance? Who had hidden it, and why? As she looked at the words on the page, her heart pounded with a terrifying thought. Sophia's name wasn't just a coincidence. It was a sign, a thread woven into something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. This was just the beginning. The truth was much darker than she had ever feared. And the answers were closer than she realized. The pages of the journal were thin, their edges brittle and curling, but Laura couldn't tear her eyes away from the drawings that filled its corners, small sketches that seemed to hold an unsettling significance. The first sketch had been simple enough, just a faint outline of a church. But the next one, drawn with an eerie precision, showed a child in a red dress, her face only partially visible, her hand outstretched toward a locket that seemed to glow from the page. The room was quiet, save for the faint shuffle of papers as Detective Valente flipped through the journal, her face unreadable. But Laura felt the air shift as she stared at the drawing. A cold chill ran down her spine, her heart thudding in her chest. That's... Laura's voice cracked, barely audible as she pointed to the child in the drawing. That's... Sophia. She was wearing a red dress when she disappeared. Detective Valente paused, her brow furrowing. She leaned in, inspecting the drawing more closely. It's the same dress. The same locket. But how? She trailed off, her voice uncertain. Laura's hand shook as she turned the page slowly, her eyes locked on the drawing. She could feel the world around her blur as the pieces started to fall into place, though she wasn't sure what to make of it yet. How could this century-old journal have a drawing of her daughter? Of Sophia? This doesn't make sense, Laura whispered, her breath catching in her throat. How could this be here? How could someone have drawn Sophia, before she went missing? Detective Valente let out a frustrated sigh, pulling the journal closer to her. It's almost like the journal was predicting her disappearance. But that doesn't make sense. This was buried beneath the Vatican floor. It couldn't possibly be a modern fabrication. The words hung in the air, thick with disbelief. Laura felt the familiar weight of dread creep up on her again, settling deep in her chest. What if there was more to this than just a strange coincidence? Valente flipped through the pages of the journal, her fingers brushing over the illustrations and the cryptic notes. This could be a clue, she said quietly, her eyes scanning the detailed writings in the margins. We need to understand where this journal came from and why it has such a direct connection to your daughter. Laura nodded, her thoughts racing. It was impossible to ignore the stark similarities between the girl in the drawing and Sophia. The red dress, the locket, everything. The journal was no ordinary artifact. It felt like it was meant for her, as if Sophia had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for someone to find this hidden piece of the puzzle. Detective Valente leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. There's something about this journal that's off, something we're not seeing yet. It feels deliberate. Like someone made sure it stayed hidden. And not just hidden, but buried. Who would go through the trouble of putting something this significant beneath the Vatican floor? The detective's words echoed in the back of Laura's mind. Why? Why would someone hide a journal that mentioned Sophia by name? Why would it reference her disappearance, even though it had been written long before? Laura's fingers tightened around the edges of the journal. Was this an ancient secret? A ritual? Or had her daughter's disappearance been part of something even bigger, something connected to the church? Detective Valente interrupted her thoughts with a small, dry chuckle. A journal buried under the Vatican floor. This is starting to feel like a Da Vinci Code sequel. Laura barely managed a small smile. It felt wrong, though. She couldn't focus on anything but the overwhelming sense of dread building in her chest. What were they uncovering? Was it all connected to something far beyond a missing child? Valente's smile faded quickly as she flipped back to the first pages of the journal. I think we've just uncovered the beginning of something much bigger than we imagine. As the detective continued to skim through the journal, Laura's mind raced. If this was some ancient document, why did it reference her daughter in such a cryptic, disturbing way? Suddenly, Valente stopped on a page near the back. The detective's face hardened as she read aloud, her voice tight with confusion. There's a note here. Valente paused, her fingers running across the page. It says she is the chosen one. The key to the gate will open at the right time, and her blood will mark the end of the waiting. Laura's throat tightened as she felt a cold sweat break out on her skin. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The chosen one? Her blood? It made no sense, but it struck at the core of her fears. Was Sophia meant for something sinister? This is getting out of hand. Valente muttered, glancing up at Laura, her expression grim. It's like they were preparing for something. Like they were planning her disappearance long before it happened. Laura's head spun, her pulse quickening. Planning? Sophia's disappearance? Valente nodded, clearly troubled. The way this is written, it's almost like she's a piece in some bigger plan, and that plan's been set in motion for a long time. The implications hit Laura hard, and she staggered backward, the journal slipping from her hands and landing with a dull thud on the table. The room seemed to spin around her. Was this truly a coincidence, or was there something more hidden in the church's ancient halls? Something that had been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment? This journal, Valente continued, her voice low, it's been kept hidden for a reason. It's not just a relic, it's a map. A map of what happened, and what's still to come. Laura's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to shout out for answers, but she couldn't form the words. A map? Was there more to this? Was Sophia just the beginning? Valente stood up, pushing the journal aside. I need to find out where this came from. Who put it here, and why did they leave it for us to find? Laura nodded, her mind still struggling to process the magnitude of what they were uncovering. She had to know. She had to know the truth. Everything about the journal screamed danger. But the deeper they went, the more they learned, the less control they seemed to have over the story. Who had hidden it? And why? As Valente gathered her things and prepared to leave, she turned to Laura. We're close. I can feel it. But we need to keep going. We're on the edge of something huge. Laura stood frozen, watching the detective walk toward the door. She couldn't shake the feeling that the journal was only the beginning. That the next step would lead them somewhere far darker. Somewhere that, no matter how much they wanted to understand it, they might not survive. The room fell silent. The journal sat on the table, a relic that held secrets only a few knew. But as Laura looked at it one last time, she realized something terrifying. Sophia's name was written there for a reason. And the reason was yet to come. The atmosphere inside the police station felt heavier now, the weight of the journal's revelations pressing down on everyone involved. Detective Valente couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that the Vatican, for all its public displays of sympathy, was hiding something connected to Sophia's disappearance. Each new detail, Each new connection felt like another thread pulling her closer to something bigger than she could have ever imagined. As Valente sat at her desk, sorting through the files once again, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The journal was clearly more than just an ancient artifact. It was a key, a map, as she'd said earlier. But the question remained, what was it leading them to? The Vatican had never truly opened its doors to their investigation. Despite all the resources at their disposal, the Church had remained curiously reserved. They hadn't shared security footage from their own cameras, hadn't offered any help in identifying possible suspects, and had been quick to offer condolences but slow to assist in any meaningful way. It made no sense. Valente's eyes flicked to the journal again. Every detail, every cryptic reference, every line written in faded ink seemed to point back to one thing: the Vatican. It was clear now that they were not just a passive observer in this case. They were involved. But how? And to what extent? Her thoughts were interrupted when an officer entered the room, a file clutched tightly in his hands. "Detective," he said, his voice serious. "You're going to want to see this." Valente stood quickly, her heart thudding in her chest. She motioned for him to place the file on her desk. As she opened it, her eyes immediately zeroed in on a name: Father Luca. She read the brief quickly. "Father Luca," she muttered to herself. "The priest who had access to the archives where the journal was found." "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied, his voice low. "Father Luca was last seen near the Vatican around the time Sophia disappeared. We've looked through his records. He was one of the few people who had direct access to the church's old archives, where the journal was hidden. His records, however, have been wiped clean. There's no trace of where he's gone or who last saw him." Valente's pulse quickened as she processed the information. A priest with access to the journal. A priest who had disappeared without a trace. It wasn't a coincidence. There was a connection here, something deeper than anyone had anticipated. "We've contacted the Vatican, of course, but they're giving us nothing," the officer continued. "They claim Father Luca left his post voluntarily. No one can confirm where he's gone or why he disappeared. His name doesn't appear in any travel records, and there are no reports of him leaving Rome." Valente leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She'd already suspected that the Vatican had more to hide than they were willing to admit, but this was something else entirely. Father Luca had been part of something. A secret, perhaps. And he had vanished right around the time Sophia had. Could it be that he knew something about the journal? Was he involved in whatever secret the Vatican had been keeping for years? And why had he disappeared? Her thoughts churned, but there were no answers. Just more questions. "Where's he been?" Valente asked, her voice firm. "Where did he go?" The officer hesitated, a look of frustration crossing his face. "That's the problem, detective. No one knows. It's like he vanished off the face of the earth. We've traced his movements up until the day he was last seen. He spent some time at the Vatican archives, then left. But after that, nothing. His trail just ends." Valente's fingers drummed on the table, her mind working overtime. What had Father Luca been involved in? It was clear now that he had to be the key. The journal, his disappearance, it was all tied together. But how? A shadow moved at the doorway. Valente glanced up to see Laura standing there, her face drawn and pale. She had been quiet for the past few days, retreating into herself as the investigation seemed to hit a wall. But now, as she stepped into the room, there was a new determination in her eyes. "I've been thinking," Laura said quietly. "You mentioned the priest, Father Luca. Do we know anything about him? What was his role at the Vatican? Was he just a normal priest?" Valente met her gaze, her eyes hardening. He wasn't just any priest. He had access to the Church's most confidential records. He was involved with the archives. And now he's missing. And it's not just that he's gone, his disappearance is tied to Sophia. I'm sure of it. Laura's face softened with a mix of concern and confusion. But why? Why would the Vatican keep this priest's disappearance under wraps? Why wouldn't they help us? Valente stood, pacing the room as she thought. That's what I need to figure out. The Vatican has been too quiet, too evasive. Father Luca's disappearance. It's no accident. It's tied to something bigger. Something they don't want us to find. Laura's eyes widened. But what? What could be so important that they would hide it for this long? Valente stopped pacing and turned to face her. That's what we need to uncover. The journal, Father Luca, your daughter, everything points back to the Vatican. We're missing something, and whatever it is, it's buried deep. The Vatican is hiding something, Laura, and we're getting closer to it. We just have to keep digging. Laura nodded slowly, determination hardening in her features. Then let's dig. Let's find out what they're hiding. Valente turned back to the file on her desk, her fingers brushing over Father Luca's name once again. I think I know where we need to start. We need to find out what happened to Father Luca. Who he talked to last, who knew about his movements, and why he was involved with the archives in the first place. We need to know what he knew. As Valente spoke, a sudden thought struck her. Had the Vatican's silence been intentional? It wasn't just about Sophia anymore. It was about a system that had kept secrets for centuries. Secrets that were now beginning to surface, whether they wanted them to or not. The search for Father Luca began that afternoon, and it was soon clear that his disappearance was anything but ordinary. Valente and her team scoured the Vatican's records, looking for any hint of his movements, any connection to the journal or the strange notes within it. But as they dug deeper, they realized that Father Luca wasn't the only one missing. Others had disappeared, too. Low-level officials, archivists, and researchers, people whose names never appeared in any public record. People whose disappearances had never been investigated. And as Valente pieced the puzzle together, one chilling thought began to form. The Vatican had always controlled the narrative, had always been in control of the story. But now, the truth was slipping through the cracks. And it was only a matter of time before someone with power, realized that the game was up. Valente's next move would take them even deeper into the heart of the Vatican. And as they ventured further into the shadows, the question that had lingered in the back of her mind grew louder. What was the Vatican willing to sacrifice to keep its secrets hidden? Detective Valente sat at her desk, the weight of the case pressing heavily on her chest. Days of relentless questioning, hours spent reviewing the journal, and weeks of chasing down every lead had brought her to this moment. Every step had led her closer to the Vatican, closer to a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Her fingers hovered over the files on her desk, the case files open before her. She had seen the same names repeated over and over again, the same key players, the same figures who had somehow found themselves in the center of this maze. But one name kept standing out, one figure who, despite his silence, loomed larger than the others, Father Alessandro. Father Alessandro had been a high-ranking official in the Vatican, a trusted advisor who had worked closely with Father Luca. He had been the mentor, the guiding hand to Luca's inquisitive mind. When Luca had first shown an interest in the Church's deeper archives, it was Father Alessandro who had given him the access. But something about the way Father Alessandro had operated, his mysterious trips, his hidden meetings, made Valente uneasy. They had tracked him down, finally locating him in a small chapel on the outskirts of Rome. The chapel was old, worn down by time, much like the priest who had spent so many years in its shadow. As Valente and Laura entered, Father Alessandro was kneeling at the altar, his back hunched in silent prayer. When he turned and saw them, his eyes narrowed slightly, as though he had expected this moment for a long time. "Detective Valente," he greeted her with an odd calm, as if he had known the confrontation was inevitable. "We need to talk," Valente said, her voice firm. "About Father Luca. And about what you know." Father Alessandro did not flinch at the mention of Luca's name. Instead, he gestured toward a nearby pew, inviting them to sit. "I'm sure you have many questions," he said, his voice low, almost tired. "But I will answer only what I can." Laura took a seat beside Valente, her hands trembling in her lap. She had been silent throughout the investigation, watching the puzzle pieces fall into place. But now, as they finally stood before someone who might know the truth, her anxiety was palpable. She was desperate for answers. Valente leaned forward, her gaze sharp. "We know that Father Luca was involved with something at the Vatican. A hidden group. We know he had access to sensitive documents. And we know his disappearance is tied to Sophia's. Father Alessandro remained silent for a moment, his eyes shifting to the altar as if searching for words. Finally, he spoke. Sophia Matthews wasn't just any child. She was chosen. Chosen? Laura repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Chosen for what? The priest hesitated, his fingers twitching in his lap. There are things that go on in the Vatican that the world will never understand. There are forces at play, powers that have been hidden for centuries. I, too, was part of them. Valente's brow furrowed. What do you mean, part of them? Father Alessandro's voice grew quieter, the weight of his words heavy in the air. For years there has been an underground group within the Church, a faction that operates beyond the public eye. We protect secrets, secrets that have been handed down from the earliest days of the Vatican. And Sophia, she was part of it. Valente's heart skipped a beat. Part of what? What is this group? What are they hiding? Father Alessandro's gaze flicked to Laura, and for the first time, Valente saw a glimmer of guilt in his eyes. We called it the Order of the Sacred Circle. It's a group of individuals who have access to the deepest secrets of the Church. We preserve them, we protect them. Sophia Matthews was going to be part of that protection. She was the one who would carry on the legacy of the circle. Laura's face was pale, her breath shallow as she processed his words. What does this have to do with my daughter? Why was she involved? The priest paused, clearly wrestling with what to say. There are rituals, Laura. Rituals that require certain individuals. Children, specifically. Children with unique qualities. Sophia had been marked for this purpose since she was young. She was chosen because of her potential, because of the bloodline she carries. A bloodline that's been intertwined with the Church for generations. Valente's mind raced, trying to piece together what he was saying. You're telling me that my daughter was going to be used for some kind of ritual? She asked, disbelief thick in her voice. Father Alessandro didn't answer immediately. He looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Finally, he spoke. Yes. That's why she was taken. But the group, the order, wasn't prepared for someone like Luca. He had grown disillusioned. He started questioning things. He wanted to leave, to expose the truth. Why didn't you stop him? Laura's voice cracked. Why didn't you stop him from taking my daughter? Father Alessandro's shoulders slumped. I tried. But Luca, he was a threat to everything we had worked for. He was the only one who knew the truth behind Sophia's role in the circle. He knew she was meant for something far more powerful than anyone could have imagined. And when he realized that, he couldn't let it happen. He took her, Laura. He took her to protect her. Protect her? Valente scoffed. From what? From the Vatican secrets? From a group that was using her for something twisted? Father Alessandro nodded slowly, his voice growing more somber. Yes. Luca took her because he wanted to save her. But there's more. He knew the dangers of what the Order was capable of. He knew that the day she was to become part of the circle, something horrible would happen. He didn't want that for her. Laura's hands clenched tightly in her lap. So, he took her and disappeared? Why didn't you stop him? Father Alessandro's face tightened with regret. I couldn't. The power of the circle runs deep. I was bound by my own oath, just as Luca was. I couldn't interfere directly. But I knew that he would try to protect her in his own way. And so, we let him go. But it was a mistake. He underestimated them. And now she's gone. Valente's mind reeled. The connections were too clear, too undeniable. But there was something else gnawing at her, a feeling that something didn't add up. Who else is involved in this? Valente asked, her voice low and controlled. Who else is protecting these secrets? Who else knew about Sophia? Father Alessandro's eyes widened, and he looked as though he wanted to say more, but the words caught in his throat. It's not just the Order, detective. It's the highest echelons of the Church. Those who control everything. Those who have the most to lose if the truth ever gets out. Just when Valente thought they were finally getting to the heart of it, another twist emerged. The door to the room creaked open slightly, and the officer who had been standing guard stepped in, his face pale. "Detective, Mrs. Matthews," he said quickly. "You need to hear this." Valente stood immediately, her body tense with anticipation. What now? What new revelation was waiting? The officer handed her a file, his hands shaking. "We just received information. It's about someone inside the church. Someone very close to the heart of the Vatican. Someone you wouldn't expect." Valente opened the file, her heart racing as she skimmed the contents. The name at the top made her freeze. It was the last person she would have expected. Father Alessandro. She whispered under her breath, her mind trying to make sense of the new information. Could he have been the mastermind behind all of this? Had he orchestrated Sophia's disappearance from the very beginning? As the puzzle began to shift before her, she realized something terrifying. The deeper they dug, the more questions there were. And just when they thought they had the answers, another revelation, another twist, emerged from the shadows. Sophia's disappearance wasn't just about one priest, or even one secret group. It was bigger than that. And the people behind it were much closer to the Vatican's core than anyone had imagined. The air in the police station felt thick, almost suffocating, as Detective Valente sat across from Laura. The files were scattered on the desk in front of them, documents, photographs, and reports that had accumulated over the past few months. Each one was a piece of the puzzle, but they had only brought more questions, more confusion. What had started as the disappearance of a child had now unraveled into a web of secrets, so deep that it seemed the very foundation of the Vatican was shaking under the weight of it all. Valente picked up a report, her fingers lingering on the edges. Her eyes flicked to Laura, who sat silently, staring down at the journal they had uncovered. The journal with Sophia's name written in it. The journal that had somehow linked the child to an ancient and dangerous order within the church. But it wasn't just the journal. It wasn't just the ritualistic references or the cryptic notes. It was the people who had been hiding behind it all. People with the power to manipulate, to control, and to erase any trace of their involvement. The clues had always pointed to someone higher up, someone with the resources to conceal the truth, someone who knew the Vatican's deepest secrets. And as the investigation progressed, it became painfully clear that the people Valente and Laura had been chasing were not mere bystanders in this conspiracy. They were part of a much bigger plan, one that had been set into motion long before Sophia Matthews had ever set foot in the Vatican. The phone rang, and Valente's hand shook as she reached for it, already bracing herself for the next twist in the case. "This is Detective Valente," she said, her voice tight. "Detective, it's Franco," came the voice on the other end. Franco was one of the officers working on the case. "You need to get down here. We've got something. A tip. It could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Valente's heart skipped a beat. "I'm on my way." When she arrived at the station, Franco was waiting for her. He led her down the familiar hallway to a small interrogation room where an informant sat, his face hidden behind the shadows of a hood. "This is the one I told you about," Franco said, his voice low. "He claims to have seen something. Something big." Valente nodded, her mind already racing. She could feel the tension building as they approached the informant. He looked up slowly as they entered, his eyes wary and cautious. "You've been waiting for me," Valente said, her voice steady but filled with the urgency of the moment. "What do you know about Father Luca? About Sophia's disappearance?" The informant hesitated for a moment, his hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. He looked around the room, as though making sure no one was listening. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke. "I saw him," the man whispered, his voice hoarse. "I saw him with a cardinal. The night before she disappeared, Father Luca was meeting with someone important. The cardinal, I didn't know his name at the time, but now I'm sure. He's the one behind all of this." Valente leaned in, her heart racing. "A cardinal? Which one?" "What do you mean by behind all of this?" The informant looked over his shoulder again, his voice barely audible. "I don't know all the details, but this cardinal, he's been involved in everything. The order, the rituals, the disappearances. He's the one pulling the strings." He used Father Luca to get to the children. Sofia was just one of many. But Father Luca, he started asking questions. He wanted out. So the Cardinal. He paused, his voice faltering. The Cardinal knew Luca had to be silenced. So he made sure Sofia was taken. He used her to keep Luca in line. But when Luca started to get too close, he knew he couldn't let him go. Valente's breath caught in her throat. The Cardinal had been at the heart of it all. The one orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. The one who had pulled the strings to make sure Sophia Matthews was involved in this twisted plan. Who is he? Valente asked, her voice urgent. What's his name? The informant's gaze dropped to the floor, his voice trembling. Cardinal Giovanni Marchetti. He's been with the Vatican for years. He's the one who controls the archives, the ones where the journal was kept. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what was at stake. And when Luca started digging too deep, the Cardinal had to act quickly. Valente's stomach turned as the weight of the revelation settled over her. Giovanni Marchetti. The name felt like a knife lodged in her chest. Marchetti was a prominent figure within the Vatican, known for his power and influence. He had ties to some of the Church's most ancient and secretive operations. And now, it seemed, he was at the center of everything. Laura, who had been standing silently by Valente's side, stepped forward. Her face was pale, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. So this Cardinal is the one who took my daughter. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a mother's heartbreak. Valente nodded, her eyes never leaving the informant. It seems that way. Marchetti's been using people like Father Luca to cover up the truth. But now we know he's the one pulling the strings. The informant's hands trembled as he spoke again. You don't understand. The Cardinal, he's untouchable. No one can go after him. He's too powerful. The Vatican has protected him for years. He's above the law. Above everything. Valente's mind raced. Could it be true? Was the Vatican shielding a man so powerful that even the police couldn't touch him? If Marchetti was behind everything, if he was the one who had orchestrated Sophia's disappearance, then the investigation was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Valente left the station, her mind swirling with the new information. She had been right all along. The Vatican had known more than they had admitted, but the deeper she dug, the more dangerous the truth became. Cardinal Giovanni Marchetti was at the heart of it all. And if he was truly behind Sophia's disappearance, then the entire church was involved. As Valente walked back to her car, the weight of the case felt heavier than ever. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but with each new revelation, the stakes grew higher. Marchetti's involvement was a game-changer. He wasn't just a man of the church, he was a man of power, a man who could have easily manipulated the Vatican's vast resources for his own gain. But the questions remained. What did Marchetti know about Sophia? Why had he been so involved in keeping her in the church's dark secrets? And most importantly, could they bring him to justice? Could they even touch him, given his influence? Valente felt the pressure mounting as she thought about the next steps. They had the truth now, but the real challenge would be exposing Marchetti for the crimes he had committed, and facing the wrath of the Vatican in the process. The road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a case about a missing child anymore. It was about the very foundation of power within the church, a foundation that had hidden its darkest secrets for centuries. And Valente, alongside Laura, was going to bring it all into the light. But as she sat in her car, staring at the Vatican in the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. A storm was coming. And they had no idea how powerful the forces they were up against really were. The final push had begun. But would the truth ever truly be revealed? And what would it cost to uncover the Vatican's most dangerous secret? The questions lingered in Valente's mind as she turned the key in the ignition, knowing the next steps would decide everything. The weight of the arrest hung heavily in the air, a bitter resolution to the twisted puzzle that had consumed Laura's life for the past several months. Cardinal Giovanni Marchetti, once a powerful figure at the heart of the Vatican, was now behind bars. His days of manipulating the Church's darkest secrets were over, at least for now. The authorities, after a lengthy investigation, had managed to bring him to justice. His ties to the Order of the Sacred Circle, the rituals, the cover-ups, the child sacrifices, it was all there, laid bare for the world to see. The Vatican's veil of secrecy had been torn away, and the truth had finally come to light. But despite the headlines that celebrated Marchetti's capture, Laura felt none of the relief that others seemed to find. She didn't feel a sense of closure, nor did she feel vindicated. She felt nothing. Only emptiness. Sophia was gone. She had been taken by the very people who were meant to protect her, to guide her. The scandal had rattled the church to its core, yet the loss of her daughter was not something any amount of justice could ever repair. The scars remained, etched into her heart like an indelible mark. Sitting alone in her hotel room, Laura couldn't bring herself to unpack. The clothes she had carefully folded weeks ago still lay in the suitcase, untouched. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She couldn't even bring herself to call home, to speak to her friends, to try to explain it all. What could she say? That her daughter was gone, taken by those who had hidden in the shadows of the world's most powerful institution. Her fingers brushed against the photograph of Sophia that lay on the table. A picture of a child full of life, full of laughter, full of promise. It was hard to reconcile the little girl in the photo with the truth she now knew. Sophia had never just been a victim of circumstance. She had been a part of something much darker, something the Vatican had been hiding for centuries. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She wiped her eyes hastily, trying to push back the waves of grief that threatened to overwhelm her. It was Detective Valente, her expression as unreadable as always, but there was a softness in her eyes now, a recognition of the weight Laura carried. "I wanted to check in on you," Valente said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of understanding that only someone who had seen too much could provide. Laura nodded absently. "It's over. The case is closed." Valente hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Yes. But I know it doesn't feel like it's over for you. Nothing will bring her back." Laura's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. "How can I live with this? I know why it happened, but it doesn't make any of it easier. Sophia is gone. She's not coming back." Valente sat down across from her, folding her hands. "You've had answers, Laura. You've faced the truth, and I know it's not what you wanted, but at least you know why. At least now you can begin to heal." But Laura could feel the hollow ache in her chest, the one that hadn't subsided. No matter how many times Valente or the police had reassured her, no matter how many pieces of the puzzle had been put in place, it didn't change the fact that her daughter was gone. "I don't think I'll ever heal from this," Laura whispered. "The damage done is irreversible. The life we were supposed to have, it's gone." Valente sighed softly, understanding more than words could express. "The church, they took more than just her, Laura. They took your peace, your sense of security. But you're strong. And you'll find a way to live with the truth." But the truth wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to know why Sophia had been taken. It wasn't enough to understand the dark web of conspiracies that had tied her daughter to this cruel fate. It wasn't enough to know that Cardinal Marchetti had been arrested, that justice had been served. None of it was enough to fill the void that now consumed Laura's every waking moment. She stood up slowly, walking to the window and staring out at the city below. The ancient buildings of Rome stretched out before her, a landscape full of history, full of secrets. But no matter how many centuries of tradition surrounded her, no matter how many tourists passed through the streets each day, none of it would ever bring Sophia back. The silence in the room felt suffocating, but Valente didn't press. She simply let Laura have her space, understanding that the road ahead would be long, full of grief and uncertainty. For days, Laura struggled to find any semblance of normalcy. She visited the places she and Sophia had gone. The gelato shop near the Vatican, the park where they had spent an afternoon just weeks before Sophia disappeared. Everywhere she went, the ghost of her daughter seemed to follow. One afternoon, as she walked down a quiet street, she noticed an old man sitting outside a cafe, reading a newspaper. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and for a moment he stared at her, his expression unreadable. But then, as she walked past, she heard him mutter something to himself. Something that sent a shiver down her spine. Another child lost, another secret buried. The words hung in the air, and Laura stopped in her tracks. Another child lost? Was this about Sophia? Was there something she hadn't been told? Had there been more children like Sophia, caught up in this conspiracy? The realization struck her like a cold wave. The truth had been exposed, yes, but it wasn't the whole truth. The Vatican's secrets ran deeper than anyone had imagined. With Marchetti's arrest, it seemed the case was closed. But there was still so much more to uncover. How many other children had fallen victim to the same sinister forces? And how many more were still out there, waiting for their own truths to come to light? Laura's thoughts spiraled as she walked back to her hotel. She had the answers she needed, but they weren't the answers she wanted. The case was over, but it wasn't really over. She had gotten her closure, but the real fight was just beginning. And this time, it wouldn't just be about one child. It would be about exposing the depths of a conspiracy that spanned centuries. And, if she was strong enough, she would make sure no other child would have to suffer the same fate. As she stood in front of her hotel door, her hand on the handle, she took a deep breath. The case was closed, but the battle for the truth, her daughter's truth, was far from over. The days following the closing of the case felt like an endless blur. Rome, the city that had once promised so much to Laura and her daughter, now felt like a place haunted by shadows. It was no longer a city of hope, of memories made in the soft sunlight of St. Peter's Square. Now it felt empty, like an illusion she had once clung to. Laura spent the following weeks trying to make sense of it all, of the strange rituals, the hidden group, the journal that had pulled her into a world she could never have imagined. The arrest of Cardinal Marchetti had offered her a brief, fleeting sense of justice. But in truth, it didn't bring her any peace. The truth that had come to light was darker than she could have ever prepared for. Sophia's name was now tied to something so sinister, something that had stretched back through the centuries, hidden within the very walls of the Vatican. Her daughter, her sweet, innocent girl, had been caught up in something much bigger than any of them could have imagined. But even as the case closed, Laura couldn't let it go. The truth about Sophia's fate, the chilling revelation that she had been part of something so dark, had left a mark that would never fade. She had tried to move on, tried to find some semblance of normalcy, but the haunting questions lingered in her mind. How many others had been involved? How many more children had suffered the same fate as Sophia? At night, when the city outside her window grew quiet, Laura would lie awake in bed, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. The feeling of loss never left her. Even though she had answers, those answers only revealed a larger, far more disturbing reality. And the truth was, those answers had come too late. She thought about Father Luca, the priest who had tried to protect Sophia. He had taken her to shield her from whatever darkness was waiting in the church's depths, but his actions had only prolonged the inevitable. He had disappeared, a ghost of the past, leaving Laura with more questions than answers. As for Cardinal Marchetti, though justice had been served, it felt like a hollow victory. He was but one piece of a far larger puzzle, a puzzle that Laura would never fully solve. But there was one thing she knew for certain: Sophia would never be forgotten. No matter what dark forces had tried to claim her, no matter how many lies were woven into the tapestry of the Vatican's secrets, Sophia would always be remembered. In the weeks that followed, Laura spent time with the few people she trusted, Detective Valente, who had stood by her throughout the investigation, and the few friends who hadn't abandoned her when the world turned cold. Together, they pieced together what they could from the investigation, but it never felt like enough. Laura walked the streets of Rome one last time, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. She passed by the gelato shop where she and Sophia had stopped before, the same one where they had shared laughs and ice cream beneath the summer sun. That place, that moment, felt like a lifetime ago. As she stood at the edge of St. Peter's Square, looking out at the majestic basilica, she realized something. The Vatican, for all its power, could hide the truth, could bury it beneath layers of history and secrecy. But it could never erase what had happened to Sophia. It could never take away the love she had for her daughter. Laura closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the wind carry the weight of her grief. She couldn't change what had happened. But she could keep Sophia's memory alive. She could make sure that no matter how many secrets were buried beneath the surface, no matter how many children had suffered, the truth would eventually come to light. Sophia's story wasn't over. Not as long as Laura was still breathing. And for the first time in months, Laura felt a spark of hope, small and fragile but still there. She wouldn't stop. She would never stop seeking the truth. Not just for Sophia, but for every child whose voice had been silenced, for every secret that had been buried too deep to ever be forgotten. As she walked away from the square, a sense of purpose filled her. She knew what she had to do. It wasn't over. It could never be over. Not while there were still truths to uncover.